The billionaire pretended to be disabled at his wedding. What the Maid's toddler revealed about the fiancé changed everything. The Harrington estate sat on 40 acres of manicured perfection on the outskirts of Napa Valley, California, a monument to old money, new power, and the kind of privilege that most people only read about in magazines. White marble columns framed the entrance, and rose gardens stretched as far as the eye could see, their petals trembling in the warm September breeze. But on this particular Thursday morning, it wasn't the grandeur of the estate that caught Maria Lopez's attention. It was him. John Harrington, 34 years old, CEO of Harrington Global Ventures, Forbes 400 regular, and one of the most discussed bachelors on the West Coast, sat near the east window of the Grand Library, his wheelchair positioned at an angle that caught the golden morning light. He was reading, not scrolling through his phone like most men his age, but actually reading, a worn copy of Gabriel Garcia Marquez's Love in the Time of Cholera. His dark hair was slightly disheveled, and his broad shoulders, even beneath his casual gray sweater, hinted at a physical strength that seemed at odds with the chair beneath him. Maria stood in the doorway, her cleaning cart loaded with supplies, her heart hammering the way it always did when she had to work around Mr. Harrington. Not because she was afraid of him, he had always been polite, sometimes even kind in a distracted, distant sort of way, but because there was something about his stillness, something layered and complex beneath the surface, that made her feel as though she was perpetually interrupting something private. She was 28 years old, a single mother, and had been working at the Harrington estate for 3 years now. Every day she drove 40 minutes from her small apartment in Vallejo, dropped her 3-year-old daughter Maya at her neighbor Mrs. Guerrero's home, and arrived at the estate by 7 a.m. She cleaned, organized, polished, and disappeared, which was exactly what the job required. She was invisible by design. But Maria had never quite mastered the art of invisibility. She noticed things. She cared about things. And lately, she couldn't stop noticing the small inconsistencies in the world of John Harrington. Like the way his physical therapist, Dr. Rains, would arrive each Tuesday and Thursday morning, but the sessions always ended early. Like the way the household staff was never permitted on the 3rd floor, where John's private gym was located. Like the way he sometimes caught himself mid-movement, as if his body had forgotten the role his mind was playing. She told herself it was none of her business. She told herself she was imagining things. But Maria Lopez had grown up in a household where the truth was always hiding in the details, and she had learned early on never to ignore the details. The announcement had come 2 weeks ago, splashed across every society page and business news outlet in California. John Harrington was engaged. His fiancée, Ana Rodriguez, 24 years old, was a stunning former beauty queen-turned-philanthropist, the daughter of one of Mexico City's wealthiest real estate developers. The engagement party was set for Saturday. The wedding, just 6 weeks away. The whole estate had been buzzing with preparations, florists, caterers, designers, coordinators, a small army of professionals transforming the already breathtaking property into something out of a fairy tale. And at the center of it all, seated in his wheelchair with his calm, watchful eyes, was John Harrington. Maria watched him turn a page of his book, his long fingers careful and deliberate. She thought about her daughter Maya, who would wake up this morning asking for her abuela's tamales and probably cry when she remembered they were going to Mrs. Guerrero's instead. She thought about the $847 electric bill she still hadn't paid, and the preschool application she needed to submit before Friday, and the way her lower back had been aching for weeks from the physical demands of this job. And then she thought about what she had seen last night, something she hadn't told a single soul, something that had kept her awake until 3 a.m. with her heart pounding and her thoughts spinning in confused circles. She had come back to retrieve her phone, which she'd left in the East Wing utility closet. It was past 9 p.m., the rest of the staff long gone, the estate quiet except for the distant sound of music playing somewhere upstairs. She was passing through the hallway near the indoor pool when she heard a splash, and then another. And when she peered through the glass panel in the door, what she saw stopped her cold. John Harrington was in the pool, not floating, not being assisted, not engaged in any kind of adaptive swimming program. He was swimming. Powerfully. Beautifully. His arms cutting through the water with the confident precision of a man who had been doing it his whole life. His legs kicking strong and steady beneath the surface. The wheelchair sat empty beside the pool, its chrome frame gleaming under the blue water lights. Maria had pressed herself against the wall, her breath caught in her throat, her mind racing through every possible explanation. A miracle recovery? A misdiagnosis? Some kind of temporary paralysis that came and went.
She didn't know.
She couldn't know. But one thing she knew with absolute certainty: the man in that pool was not disabled. And the wedding was in 6 days. Maria didn't sleep well that night or the night after. She moved through her work at the estate like a woman carrying something too heavy to put down and too dangerous to keep holding. She smiled when spoken to. She answered questions when asked. She polished silverware, pressed linens, and arranged fresh-cut flowers in the grand foyer as the wedding preparations reached a fever pitch around her. But her mind was somewhere else entirely, circling back, again and again, to that glass panel and what she had seen through it. She tried to tell herself that it wasn't her place. She was the maid. He was the billionaire. There were rules about such things, invisible but ironclad, and she had spent 3 years at the Harrington estate carefully honoring every single one of them. She didn't ask questions. She didn't form opinions. She certainly didn't insert herself into the personal affairs of the family that paid her salary. But this wasn't just a personal affair. There was a woman involved. Ana Rodriguez, 24 years old, preparing to walk down the aisle and commit her life to a man who was, apparently, keeping a secret large enough to reshape everything she believed about who she was marrying. Maria had met Ana twice since the engagement announcement. The first time was a brief encounter in the Rose Garden, where Ana had been overseeing the installation of an elaborate floral arch with the serene authority of someone who had grown up orchestrating beauty. She was stunning, tall and graceful, with dark eyes that held a kind of intelligent warmth, the sort of woman who made a room feel curated just by entering it. She had smiled at Maria, a genuine smile, the kind that reached her eyes and said, "You must be Maria. John speaks well of you." The words had surprised her. She hadn't known that John spoke about her at all. The second encounter was more significant. Maria had been in the kitchen retrieving supplies when she overheard Ana speaking on the phone in the adjacent sitting room. The door was partially open, and though Maria had no intention of eavesdropping, the words floated through before she could retreat. "I know what people say about me, Mama," Ana was saying, her voice low and steady, but with a current of something raw running beneath it. "They think I'm marrying him for the money. They think I couldn't possibly love a man in a wheelchair unless there was something in it for me. But I do love him. I love him because he is kind and brilliant and funny and real. I love him because when I'm with him, I feel like myself. And yes, I love him because he needs me, and I have never felt more purposeful in my life than when I am taking care of someone who matters." A pause. "Please don't try to talk me out of this, Mama. He is the person I'd choose." Maria had set down her supplies and stood very still in the kitchen, her eyes closed, listening to the weight of what Ana had just said. "I love him because he needs me." Those words settled into Maria's chest like stones, heavy and complicated. Because if John didn't need Ana the way Ana believed he did, if the wheelchair was a performance, a fabrication, a lie, then what was Anna's love built on? And more than that, what would it do to Ana to find out on the other side of a wedding that the foundation of her devotion had been constructed on sand? That evening, after her shift, Maria sat her car in the employee parking lot for a long time before starting the engine. Maya would be waiting at Mrs. Guerrero's, probably overtired and maybe a little tearful, and Maria would hold her daughter on her lap and read her the same 3 picture books they read every night, and Maya's small warm weight would ground her in the only way that ever truly worked. But right now, Maria needed a minute. Just a minute to think about who she was and what she believed and what kind of person she wanted to be. She had grown up watching her mother clean other people's houses. She had grown up watching her father work 2 jobs and still come home with hands that trembled from exhaustion. She had grown up understanding, bone deep, that people like her didn't speak up. People like her didn't make waves. People like her survived by being exactly what was expected, reliable, quiet, grateful for the work. And for 28 years, Maria had honored that understanding. She had been careful. She had been small. She had bitten her tongue so many times, she was surprised it still functioned properly. But then she thought about Maya. 3 years old, with her father's dark curly hair and Maria's stubborn chin, and a laugh that could fill any room she entered. Maya, who called butterflies flutterbice, and insisted on wearing her shoes on the wrong feet because she liked the way it felt. Maya, who had already learned, far too young in Maria's opinion, that the world expected her to be small, too. Maria was raising a daughter. And daughters watched everything. They absorbed everything. They learned who they were supposed to be by watching who their mothers chose to be. She started the engine. She drove to Mrs. Guerrero's. She picked up her daughter and held her close in the fading September light, breathing in the scent of her hair, and she made a decision. She didn't know yet what she was going to do with what she knew. But she knew she wasn't going to pretend she didn't know it. That much she owed to herself. And to Anna. And, she realized with a complexity that surprised her, to John himself, because whatever was driving this performance, whatever wound or fear had led him to this elaborate deception, it could not be healed by lies. And Maria Lopez, daughter of a woman who had cleaned other people's messes her whole life, had decided it was time to stop pretending that what was broken didn't need fixing. The morning of the engagement party arrived wrapped in California gold, the kind of September day that felt like the season's last perfect gift before autumn arrived in earnest. The Harrington estate had been transformed overnight. Fairy lights threaded through every tree, long tables draped in ivory linen stretching across the back lawn, an orchestra already warming up near the garden pavilion. 200 guests would arrive by noon. The champagne was chilled. The canapés were plated. And Maria had arrived at 6 a.m. to make sure every last detail of her domain, the interior spaces, the service corridors, the kitchens, was flawless. She had brought Maya with her. It wasn't something she did often. In fact, she had only brought her daughter to work twice before, both times in emergencies when Mrs. Guerrero was unavailable and there was no other option. The estate had a strict no-children policy for staff, not written anywhere but understood, the way so many rules were understood in places like this. But Mrs. Guerrero had a doctor's appointment, and Maria's sister was in Sacramento, and she hadn't been able to find anyone else on such short notice. She had dressed Maya in her best outfit, a little yellow dress with white daisies that her mother had sent from Guadalajara, and braided her hair, and explained, very seriously, that she had to be quiet and stay close and not touch anything. Maya had listened with the solemn attentiveness of a child who genuinely wanted to be good, which lasted approximately 11 minutes before she began asking questions. Mama, why does that man have so many flowers? For a party, Mija. Is it his birthday?
No.
He's getting married. What's married? It's when two people love each other very much and decide to stay together. Like you and Daddy? The question landed softly, like something fragile being set down on a hard surface. No, baby. Not like me and Daddy. Something better than that. They had been working their way through the interior of the East Wing when Maria heard it, a sound from around the corner that made her stop. It was John's voice, low and tense, the way she had never quite heard it before. She held Maya's hand and stayed still. She can't find out, he was saying. Not like this. Not the day of the party. A second voice. She recognized it as his older brother, Daniel. John, this has gone too far. You told me it was temporary. You told me it was just until the business deal with Rodriguez closed. That was 6 months ago. Now, there's a wedding date. I know. She loves you. The real you. Or what she thinks is the real you. But she doesn't know the real you, does she? She knows the wheelchair. She knows the dependence. She built her entire feeling about this relationship around being your partner in a specific way. I know that. Then you know it's not fair to her. A long silence. And then, very quietly, I know. I just don't know how to fix it without losing her. Maria pressed herself against the wall, Maya tucked close to her side, her daughter's small hand wrapped warm and trusting in her own. She heard the heaviness in John's voice, not the tone of a con man, not the cold calculation of someone without a conscience, but the sound of a person who had made a decision they couldn't undo and had been living inside the consequences for so long they had forgotten what the air outside felt like. She guided Maya gently back in the direction they had come from, her mind working quickly, her heart doing something complicated in her chest. But Maya, being 3 years old and therefore entirely ungoverned by the social awareness that might have kept her mother quiet, chose that exact moment to tug free of Maria's hand and run. Not fast, not far, just around the corner, drawn by the sight of a golden retriever she had spotted through the glass doors of the sitting room. Pero. Mama, Pero. By the time Maria caught up to her, Maya was already in the sitting room. And John Harrington was already there, in his wheelchair, having just ended his conversation with his brother. And Maya, 3 years old, in her yellow daisy dress, with her mother's stubbornness and her own kind of fearless grace, had walked right up to John's wheelchair and put her small hand on his knee and looked up at him with big dark eyes and said, with the matter-of-fact clarity of a child who has not yet learned to be polite at the expense of honest, "Why do you use that chair if your legs work?" The room went absolutely silent. John stared at her. Maria felt the blood leave her face. She started to reach for Maya, to apologize, to say something, anything, but then she saw it. She saw the exact moment that something in John Harrington cracked open. It was in his eyes, first a sudden, shattering vulnerability, like the surface of ice giving way. And then in his hands, which dropped to his lap and stayed there, still and open, as if he had suddenly put something down that he had been carrying for a very long time. "What's your name?" he asked Maya, his voice barely above a whisper. "Maya," she said. "That's a beautiful name." "Thank you." She patted his knee again, gentle and unself-conscious. "You should use your legs. Legs are for walking." He looked up then, and his eyes met Maria's. And in that look was an entire world, shame, relief, grief, gratitude, and something that might, just barely, have been the first fragile breath of the kind of honesty that begins when there is nowhere left to hide. "Mrs. Lopez," he said quietly, "I think we need to talk." He told her everything. Not all at once. It came in pieces, the way things long compressed tend to emerge, slowly at first, then in a rush that seemed to surprise even him. Maria sat across from him in the small study off the library, Maya asleep on the sofa beside her with her shoes on the wrong feet and her hands curled under her cheek, and John Harrington told her the truth about the wheelchair, about Anna, about himself, and about the year and a half that had led to this particular morning. It had started, he explained, with a skiing accident 18 months ago, a bad fall in Aspen that had resulted in a spinal contusion, temporary paralysis from the waist down, and 6 terrifying weeks in which the doctors could not confirm whether the damage was permanent. It was during those 6 weeks that he had met Ana Rodriguez at a charity gala where he had been presented publicly in a wheelchair for the first time. He had been raw that night, stripped of the armor that wealth and success usually provided, uncertain of his future, confronting the sudden and vertiginous reality of physical vulnerability. And Anna had sat beside him for 3 hours and talked to him, not about his net worth or his business interests or what his recovery timeline might mean for Harrington Global, but about Garcia Marquez and Frida Kahlo and the particular loneliness of being surrounded by people who only see what you can offer them. He had fallen in love with her in those 3 hours. completely and helplessly, the way he had never fallen in love with anyone before. The paralysis had resolved over the following months, gradually, then more completely than his doctors had initially dared to hope. By December, he was walking. By February, he was running. By March, he was in the pool every morning, rebuilding the strength he had lost, grateful in a way that felt almost spiritual for the return of a body he had taken entirely for granted before the accident. But by March, he was also deeply, irreversibly in love with a woman who had fallen in love with a version of him that no longer existed in the same form. And he was terrified. "I told myself it was just temporary," he said, his voice careful and deliberate, as though he were handling each word with caution. "I told myself I would tell her. I kept saying, next week, next month, after this trip, after this business deal, after we get through this particular complicated period." He paused. "But then she said yes when I proposed. And then there was a wedding date. And every time I tried to find the moment to tell her, I thought about the way she had looked at me in that hospital corridor in February, when I was still using a cane and still afraid. She had looked at me like I was enough, like I was exactly enough. And I was terrified that if she knew I was fully recovered, the equation would change. That she would see a different man and realize she had loved a circumstance, not a person." Maria listened without speaking. There was something about the honesty of what he was saying that demanded to be received in full, without interruption. She thought about what she had heard him say to his brother, "I just don't know how to fix it without losing her." She thought about Anna in the sitting room, saying I love him because he needs me. Two people, both trying to love each other, both operating from versions of the truth that had become distorted by fear. "Can I say something?" she said finally. He looked at her, surprised, perhaps, to be asked for permission in his own home by his maid. "Please," he said. "Anna doesn't love you because you need her," Maria said. "I heard her say those words, and I understand why you interpreted them the way you did. But she was defending herself to her mother. She was defending the right to love someone that people assumed she couldn't possibly love for the right reasons. She was saying, I love him because I see him, not because of what he lacks." She paused, searching for the right words. "What she needs from you isn't a wheelchair. What she needs from you is the man who sat beside her for 3 hours and talked to her about Frida Kahlo when he was afraid. That man is still here, Mr. Harrington. He never went anywhere." John was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the sound of the engagement party preparations continued. Music, laughter, the distant clink of champagne glasses. The world going on, cheerfully oblivious to the reckoning happening in this small, sunlit room. "What if you're wrong?" he asked. "Then at least you'll know," she said. "And she'll know. And you can both make real choices, based on real information. Right now, neither of you has that. You're both living inside a story that isn't quite true." She looked at her sleeping daughter, the small peaceful rise and fall of her chest. "I have a daughter. She's 3 years old, and she has no idea yet how complicated the world is. But I am raising her, and part of raising her is showing her what it looks like when people choose honesty even when it's scary. Even when it costs them something." She looked back at John. "You have 200 guests arriving in 4 hours. And you have a choice to make before they get here." He looked at Maya for a long moment. This small child who had, with the unself-conscious candor of the very young, cut through 18 months of carefully constructed silence in a single question. "Why do you use that chair if your legs work?" Simple.
Direct.
Unanswerable. He straightened in the wheelchair. And then, slowly, he stood up. He found Anna in the garden, near the rose arch that had been installed for the party, her dark hair pinned up with a few loose strands falling around her face, a cup of tea in her hand as she reviewed notes from the event coordinator with a small crease of concentration between her brows. She was beautiful in the casual morning light, beautiful in the way that had nothing to do with preparation or performance, just the natural, unself-conscious beauty of a person who is entirely at home in their own skin. She looked up when she heard him coming, and then she went very still. He was walking toward her, not with a cane, not with a physical therapist at his elbow. Walking, steadily, without hesitation, across the flagstone path of the rose garden, his footsteps even and certain, his hands loose at his sides. He covered the distance between them in 30 seconds that felt, to both of them, like something entirely outside of ordinary time. She set down her cup. She set down her notes. The event coordinator made a sound of polite confusion and then apparently decided, with good instinct, that this was a moment requiring privacy and quietly withdrew. Anna looked at John for a long moment without speaking. Her face was unreadable at first, carefully, consciously held in a stillness that Maria, watching from a respectful distance through the east wing window, recognized as the look of a woman who is taking a breath before a plunge. And then, very softly, Anna said, "How long?" 6 months, he said. "I'm so sorry, Anna. I am so deeply sorry." She turned away from him then and walked a few steps toward the roses, her hand reaching out to touch one without seeming to be aware she was doing it. Her shoulders were very straight and very still. John waited. "Why?" she asked, her voice quiet. Not accusatory. Genuinely asking. The voice of a person who needed to understand something before she could know what she felt about it. And he told her. Not a condensed version, not a diplomatic summary, but all of it. The accident, the fear, the weeks of uncertainty, the night they met, the way he had fallen in love with her in the context of his own vulnerability, and then, as that vulnerability receded, had become terrified that what she loved had left with it. He told her about the pool and the gym and the physical therapy sessions that had ended early because there was nothing left to rehabilitate. He told her about the conversation with his brother. And then, with a steadiness that seemed to cost him something real, he told her about Maria's daughter. A 3-year-old, Anna said, and something moved across her face that was almost, Maria thought, a complicated form of relief. A 3-year-old saw what you couldn't tell me. Yes, he said. Another silence. In the garden, a bird sang somewhere above them, indifferent and sweet. The late morning sun moved behind a cloud and then came out again, washing everything in clear September light. "Do you know what I was afraid of?" Anna said finally, still facing the roses. "I was afraid that people were right, that I was naive, that what I had convinced myself was real love was actually, I don't know, a savior complex, some kind of performance of goodness that I was doing for myself more than for you. My mother said it. My friends said it. Even the press said it." She turned around then, and her eyes were bright, not with tears, exactly, but with something close to it. "And every time someone said it, I would think, but I know what I feel. I know what this is. And what I felt for you wasn't about the wheelchair, John. It was never about the wheelchair." "I know that now," he said. "I couldn't see it. I was too afraid." "I know," she said. And something in her voice, something quiet and clear and absolutely certain, told Maria, still watching from the window, that this was not the sound of a woman being manipulated or deceived or taken advantage of. This was the sound of a woman who had just been handed the truth and was deciding, with clear eyes and full information, what she wanted to do with it. Anna crossed the flagstone path and stood in front of him and put her hands on either side of his face and looked at him, really looked at him, the way Maria had watched her look at him a dozen times before, but with something new and different now, something stripped of the uncertainty that fear always leaves behind. "I fell in love with a man who talked to me about Frida Kahlo for 3 hours when he was afraid of his own future," she said. "And then I kept falling in love with him, every day, for 18 months. I didn't fall in love with a wheelchair, John. I fell in love with you." She paused. "The question is whether you can trust that. Whether you can stop being so afraid of the truth that you hide from it inside a beautiful, well-constructed lie." "I can," he said. "I want to. I'm trying to start right now." She studied him for another moment, her dark eyes searching his face with the thoroughness of someone who needs to be very sure of what they're seeing. And then she said, "Okay." Just that. One word, small and enormous. "Okay." And she kissed him, softly, briefly, the kind of kiss that is less about passion than about choosing. At the window, Maria exhaled. She hadn't realized she had been holding her breath. The engagement party that afternoon was not what anyone had expected, in the best possible way. It was John who suggested it, quietly, to Anna, while the guests were still arriving and the champagne was still being poured. He wanted to be honest with the people who mattered to them. Not publicly, not dramatically, not in a way that would turn their love story into spectacle. Just honestly, in the way that things can be honest between people who genuinely care for each other. Anna had agreed. Of course she had agreed, because honesty was the thing she had always wanted, the thing she had been reaching for, the thing she hadn't quite known was missing. And so when John Harrington crossed the lawn of his estate that afternoon to greet his guests, he walked. Steadily, confidently, without assistance, shaking hands and embracing people who had known him for years and greeting people who had only known him from photographs. There were confused looks. There were hushed conversations. There were a few people who approached him directly and asked, with varying degrees of tact, what had happened. And each time, he answered simply, "I recovered. I should have told people sooner. I'm sorry I didn't." He said it without elaborate explanation, without excessive justification, without the kind of performative self-flagellation that would have made it more about him than about the truth. He said it plainly, and he let people process it, and he stood with Anna's hand in his and faced whatever response came with the steady openness of someone who has finally, after a long time carrying it, set something very heavy down. Maria watched from near the serving corridor, her cart parked beside her. Maya asleep again on a cushioned bench against the wall. Her daughter could sleep anywhere, which was a gift of early childhood that Maria sometimes envied. She watched John and Anna move through their guests together, watched the way their hands stayed connected, the way they leaned toward each other with the automatic ease of people who are genuinely at home in each other's presence. She watched Anna laugh at something an older woman said, her face open and luminous, and she watched John look at Anna, while she laughed with the expression of a man who cannot quite believe his own luck. Later, much later, when the party was winding down and most of the guests had gone, and the staff was beginning the long work of clearing and cleaning, John found Maria near the kitchen. Maya was awake now and draped over her mother's shoulder, blinking sleepy eyes at the fairy lights still glowing in the garden trees. "Mrs. Lopez," he said. "Mr. Harrington." He was quiet for a moment, looking at her with something she had never seen in his eyes when he looked at her before, a directness, an attentiveness, as if he were seeing her for the first time as a full person rather than a reliable presence in the background of his life. "I owe you a great deal," he said. "You don't owe me anything," she said. "It was Maya." "It was you," he said. "Whatever Maya said, it was you who was brave enough to sit across from me and tell me the truth about what I had done. That wasn't nothing, Mrs. Lopez. That required courage. The kind of courage that doesn't come from having nothing to lose." He paused. "You could have lost your job. You could have. I would like to think you knew I wouldn't, but you couldn't have been certain. And you said it anyway." Maria was quiet. Maya had fallen asleep again on her shoulder, her small hand fisted in the fabric of Maria's shirt. "I thought about my daughter," she said finally. "About what I want her to learn from watching me." He nodded slowly. And then he said something unexpected. "I'd like to offer you something. Not as payment, not as a transaction. But because you work harder than anyone on the staff, and because you did something today that I think very few people would have done, and because I looked into your file this morning and saw that you've been asking for a scheduling accommodation for your daughter's school applications, and it keeps getting lost in the system." He reached into his jacket pocket and set something on the kitchen counter beside her, a sealed envelope. "There's a letter in there. It's a recommendation for Maya's preschool applications. To every school on your list, from me. for whatever that's worth. And there's something else. I've spoken to the estate manager about restructuring your hours so that you can drop Maya at school yourself every morning. Full-time benefits unchanged. It doesn't fix everything, but it's a start. Maria looked at the envelope. She looked at John Harrington standing in the kitchen doorway, this billionaire who had spent 18 months pretending to be smaller than he was because he was afraid of losing something real, and she thought about how ordinary that fear was. How universal it was underneath all the wealth and the marble and the rose gardens and the Forbes rankings. The fear of being seen clearly and found insufficient. Everyone she had ever known had felt it. She had felt it herself every day. "Thank you," she said simply. She didn't make it more than it was. But she also didn't make it less. He nodded. He started to turn away, then stopped. "Her name is Maya," he said. "That means illusion in some traditions. But it also means love. Did you know that?" "I did," Maria said. "I chose it on purpose." He smiled at her, a real smile, the kind she had seen perhaps twice in 3 years, and walked back toward the party. Toward Anna, who was waiting for him near the Rose Arch with 2 glasses of champagne and the patient certainty of a woman who knows, finally, exactly who she has chosen. In the weeks that followed, the wedding was moved from 6 weeks away to 3 months out. John's idea, a gift of time to Anna, an opportunity to rebuild the foundation of their relationship on ground that was fully solid, fully true. They spent that time talking the way they had never quite talked before, about the accident, about the fear, about what each of them wanted from a life together now that there were no longer any performances to maintain. Anna told him things she had never told him because she had unconsciously edited herself around the version of him she thought needed protecting. He told her things he had never said because he had spent 18 months guarding a secret so carefully that honesty had become an unfamiliar country. They got married on a Sunday in December, under a clear California sky. The ceremony was smaller than originally planned, 100 people instead of 200, garden rather than grand ballroom, simple rather than spectacular. John walked down the aisle. He walked to Anna. He held her hands and said his vows in a voice that was clear and unashamed, the voice of a man who had learned, at some cost, the particular freedom of being fully known. Maria was there, in the second-to-last row, with Maya in her lap in a new yellow dress. Maya ate the tiny dinner rolls from the reception table and watched the dancing with wide, interested eyes and fell asleep halfway through the first waltz. And Maria held her sleeping daughter and watched John and Anna turn slowly under the string lights, and she thought about truth and fear and the small, ordinary moments of bravery that change everything. The truest thing, she had come to understand, was not the wheelchair or the lie, or even the dramatic garden conversation that had set everything right. The truest thing was smaller than any of that. It was a 3-year-old in wrong-footed shoes and a yellow daisy dress, walking up to a man who had forgotten who he was and reminding him with a single question, "Why do you use that chair if your legs work?" Sometimes the most honest person in any room is the one who hasn't yet learned to be afraid of the truth. And sometimes the bravest thing you can do is make sure your daughter watches you choose honesty anyway, even when you are afraid, even when it costs you something, even when the easier path is right there, wide and smooth and inviting. Maria Lopez drove home that night with Maya buckled in the back seat, streetlights passing overhead like slow stars. The electric bill was paid. The preschool application had been submitted. The lower back ache was still there but manageable. Everything was more or less the same as it had been, and also completely different in the particular way that things shift when you have done something that aligns with who you truly are. She reached back and touched her daughter's foot in the dark. Maya stirred, mumbled something about butterflies, and went back to sleep. "Good girl," Maria said softly. To Maya. To herself. To the woman she was choosing, every day, to become.